Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside.
The system. Texas has one of the largest prison systems in America. Hundreds of thousands pass through its walls. But this system was never designed to heal. It was designed to control. Steel doors, strict discipline, relentless punishment. In Texas prisons, survival matters more than change. The reality: rehabilitation is promised, but punishment is delivered. Overcrowded cell blocks, limited programs, mental health treated as a liability. Men leave prison angrier, broken, and unprepared for freedom, not because they refuse to change, but because the system never gave them the chance. The question: what happens when punishment becomes the goal? When control replaces rehabilitation? When prison prepares people to survive cages instead of society? This is not a story about crime. This is a story about a system. This is Texas prisons, built to punish, not rehabilitate. A system built for control. Texas prisons were not built with rehabilitation in mind. They were built for order, punishment, and control. From the moment an inmate enters the Texas Department of Criminal Justice system, the priorities become clear. Classification comes before counseling. Discipline comes before treatment. Compliance matters more than change. Every aspect of daily life is designed to reinforce one lesson: authority is absolute, and resistance has consequences. This philosophy is not accidental. It is rooted in decades of tough-on-crime policies that shaped Texas into one of the most punitive prison systems in the United States. Long sentences, strict supervision, and limited tolerance for deviation form the backbone of the system. Rehabilitation exists on paper, but punishment governs reality. The first thing inmates learn is structure. Wake-up calls are rigid. Counts are constant. Movement is restricted and monitored. Meals are timed, hurried, and impersonal. Every step is supervised. Every action is regulated. Even silence can be interpreted as defiance. In this environment, individuality fades quickly. Control is maintained not just through physical barriers, but through psychological pressure. Texas prisons rely heavily on discipline-based management. Infractions, even minor ones, are met with swift consequences. Loss of privileges, restriction of movement, placement in segregation. This constant threat conditions inmates to obey first and question never. For many prisoners, this creates an atmosphere of fear rather than reform. Programs meant to encourage education or self-improvement exist, but access is limited. Overcrowding strains resources. Staffing shortages reduce availability. Long waiting lists discourage participation. Some inmates wait years for basic classes, only to be transferred or released before completing them. Rehabilitation becomes optional. Punishment is guaranteed. The emphasis on control reshapes inmate behavior in predictable ways. Instead of learning responsibility, inmates learn compliance. Instead of developing self-regulation, they develop hypervigilance. They watch guards closely. They measure every word. They suppress emotion to avoid attention. Survival replaces growth. This environment also shapes prison culture. Power dynamics dominate daily life. Strength is valued. Vulnerability is dangerous. Asking for help can be seen as weakness, or worse, an invitation for exploitation. As a result, emotional needs go unmet, and psychological distress is hidden. Mental health care inside Texas prisons is severely strained. While the system houses a large population of inmates with diagnosed mental illnesses, treatment is often reactive rather than preventative. Counseling sessions are brief. Medication is prioritized over therapy. Crisis intervention replaces long-term care. For inmates struggling with anxiety, depression, trauma, or impulse control, the system offers little room for recovery. Symptoms are often misinterpreted as behavioral problems. Emotional breakdowns become disciplinary issues. Psychological pain becomes misconduct. This reinforces a dangerous cycle. An inmate struggles mentally. The system responds with punishment. Punishment worsens mental health. Worsened mental health leads to more punishment. Over time, inmates internalize the belief that the system is not there to help them change, only to contain them. Motivation to rehabilitate erodes. Hope fades. The future becomes abstract and distant. Texas prisons also emphasize classification and security level above personal development. Inmates are sorted into categories based on perceived risk. These classifications determine housing, movement, and access to programs. Once labeled, moving to a lower classification is difficult. Disciplinary history follows inmates relentlessly, even when infractions stem from untreated mental health issues. This rigid structure leaves little room for redemption. The message is clear: past behavior defines future opportunity. For many inmates, this leads to resignation. If effort does not change outcomes, effort becomes pointless. Participation in programs declines. Engagement disappears. Time is served, not used. Prison becomes a waiting room. Meanwhile, overcrowding compounds every problem. Texas prisons operate near or beyond capacity. Dorm-style housing replaces cells. Noise levels rise. Tension escalates. Privacy disappears completely. Conflict becomes inevitable. In overcrowded conditions, control becomes harder to maintain, and discipline becomes harsher. Guards rely on authority and routine to manage large populations. Individual needs are sidelined. Efficiency takes priority over care. This environment does not encourage reflection or growth. It encourages endurance. For inmates serving long sentences, the psychological toll accumulates year after year. Relationships with family weaken. Contact becomes infrequent. Visits are stressful and tightly regulated. Emotional distance grows. Prisoners begin to feel disconnected not just from society, but from themselves. The system rarely addresses this erosion. Rehabilitation programs, when available, often focus on surface-level compliance rather than deep behavioral change. Anger management courses teach restraint, not understanding. Substance abuse programs emphasize abstinence, not trauma. Education focuses on credentials, not identity. The deeper causes of criminal behavior, poverty, trauma, addiction, mental illness, remain largely unaddressed. Texas prisons are efficient at enforcing rules. They are not designed to heal wounds. This reality becomes most apparent when inmates near release. Many leave prison without adequate preparation for life outside. Limited job training, minimal counseling, no meaningful psychological support. The transition from total control to total responsibility is abrupt and unforgiving. The system assumes punishment has done its work. But punishment alone does not teach how to live. Instead, it teaches how to survive under authority, how to suppress emotion, how to distrust systems, and how to expect hostility. These lessons do not disappear at the gate. They follow inmates into society. The consequences are visible in high recidivism rates, unstable reintegration, and persistent cycles of incarceration. Yet the system often interprets these outcomes as individual failure rather than systemic design. Texas prisons do exactly what they were built to do. They punish. In the next chapter, we will move deeper inside daily life behind bars, examining how overcrowding, routine, and constant discipline shape behavior and reinforce a culture where rehabilitation struggles to exist. Because to understand why change is rare, we must first understand the environment that prevents it. Daily life inside Texas prisons. Life inside a Texas prison is not defined by rehabilitation programs or personal growth. It is defined by routine, restriction, and survival. From the moment the lights come on, the day belongs to the institution. Inmates wake not when rested, but when ordered. Count begins early and repeats throughout the day. Every movement must align with the schedule. Every delay is suspicious. Every deviation is punished. This constant regulation is not subtle. Inmates line up for meals under supervision. Conversations are monitored. Silence is often enforced. Even posture matters. Standing incorrectly, moving too slowly, or speaking at the wrong time can result in disciplinary action. Over time, prisoners learn to move carefully, speak minimally, and draw as little attention as possible. Daily life becomes a performance of obedience. Housing conditions vary, but overcrowding shapes most experiences. Many Texas prisons rely heavily on large dormitory-style units instead of individual cells. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men sleep in open spaces filled with metal bunks, thin mattresses, and constant noise. There is no privacy. Every cough, argument, nightmare, and whispered conversation is shared. Lights never fully disappear. The sound of movement never stops. For inmates, true rest becomes rare. Sleep is shallow and fragmented, interrupted by counts, noise, or tension. This environment breeds stress. Small conflicts escalate quickly when space is limited and tempers are constantly strained. Personal boundaries barely exist. Respect becomes a survival currency. A perceived slight can turn into a confrontation. Violence is not constant, but the threat of it always lingers. To survive, inmates develop defensive behaviors. They watch everything. They memorize patterns. They assess threats constantly. Hypervigilance becomes normal. In this environment, trust is dangerous. Friendships are often transactional. Alliances shift. People are transferred without warning. Familiar faces disappear overnight. Loss becomes routine, but grief has nowhere to go. Programs that might offer structure or purpose are limited by demand and availability. Work assignments exist, but many are repetitive and offer little skill development. Educational programs are scarce relative to population size. Waiting lists stretch for months or years. For many inmates, boredom becomes crushing. Hours pass slowly, marked only by counts and meals. Without meaningful engagement, the mind turns inward. Regret, anger, and anxiety intensify. The lack of stimulation erodes focus and motivation. Time feels distorted, days drag, while years vanish. Mental health services struggle to keep up. Texas prisons house a significant number of inmates with mental illness, yet resources are stretched thin. Counselors manage overwhelming caseloads. Appointments are brief and infrequent. Treatment often focuses on medication rather than therapy. Emotional expression is discouraged. Crying is seen as weakness. Talking about fear invites judgment. Asking for help can attract unwanted attention. As a result, many inmates suppress distress until it erupts as anger or withdrawal. These reactions are rarely treated as symptoms. They are treated as infractions. Disciplinary systems dominate daily life. Write-ups accumulate quickly. Infractions can be issued for disobedience, disrespect, failure to follow instructions, or perceived attitude. Consequences range from loss of privileges to segregation. This constant disciplinary pressure reinforces a culture of fear. Instead of encouraging responsibility, it encourages avoidance. Inmates learn not how to make better choices, but how not to get caught. Compliance replaces understanding. Obedience replaces reflection. Solitary confinement looms as a constant threat. While not every inmate experiences isolation, the possibility alone shapes behavior. The fear of being removed from general population keeps many silent. Segregation is known for worsening mental health, yet it remains a common response to behavioral issues. For inmates already struggling psychologically, this threat is devastating. Physical health also suffers. Limited medical access, delayed treatment, and long wait times are common complaints. Chronic conditions worsen. Stress-related illnesses increase. The body carries the same burden as the mind. Family contact provides one of the few emotional lifelines. Phone calls are brief and expensive. Visits are tightly controlled. Physical contact is restricted. Conversations feel artificial, watched, and hurried. Loved ones age, change, and move on. Inmates remain suspended in the same environment year after year. This disconnection deepens emotional isolation. Many inmates stop reaching out altogether, not because they don't care, but because each interaction reminds them of everything they've lost. Hope becomes painful. Detachment feels safer. Daily life in Texas prisons does not encourage self-improvement. It encourages endurance. Inmates learn to suppress emotion, follow orders, and survive monotony. These skills are effective inside prison walls. They are destructive outside them. By the time inmates near release, many have spent years practicing submission instead of decision-making, silence instead of communication, and vigilance instead of trust. The system assumes that surviving prison equals readiness for freedom. But survival is not preparation. In the next chapter, we will examine how overcrowding, punishment-focused policies, and limited mental health care combine to make rehabilitation increasingly difficult, and why the system continues to rely on control even when it fails. Because daily life inside Texas prisons explains everything that comes after. Overcrowding, pressure, and punishment. Texas prisons were never designed to hold the number of people they now contain. Over time, population growth outpaced infrastructure, and overcrowding became normal rather than exceptional. What followed was a system under constant strain, where pressure replaced purpose and punishment became the easiest solution. Overcrowding affects every aspect of prison life. Housing units fill beyond capacity. Dormitories meant for dozens hold hundreds. Beds are packed tightly together, leaving little room to move, let alone breathe. Noise becomes constant. Tension becomes unavoidable. Privacy disappears entirely. In this environment, control becomes more difficult, not less. When too many people are confined in limited space, minor conflicts escalate quickly. Small disagreements over space, noise, or perceived disrespect can turn volatile. The staff response is not to reduce tension, but to suppress it. Punishment becomes the primary tool. Texas prisons rely heavily on disciplinary systems to manage overcrowded populations. Write-ups increase. Restrictions become harsher. Segregation is used not only as punishment, but as population control. Removing individuals from general population creates temporary relief, but at enormous psychological cost. The system chooses efficiency over care. Guards are tasked with managing large numbers of inmates with limited resources. Training focuses on security, not mental health. When conflict arises, the fastest response is authority. Orders are given. Compliance is expected. Resistance is punished. This approach may maintain order, but it does not address underlying causes. Mental health deteriorates rapidly under overcrowded conditions. Anxiety levels rise. Depression deepens. Aggression increases. Sleep becomes fragmented. The nervous system remains in constant alert mode. For inmates with pre-existing mental illness, overcrowding accelerates decline. Treatment access becomes harder as caseloads grow. Counseling sessions shrink. Medication adjustments lag. Emotional crises are treated as disciplinary issues. This is where punishment replaces treatment entirely. Inmates experiencing breakdowns are written up for behavior they cannot control. Panic attacks are interpreted as refusal. Paranoia is interpreted as hostility. Emotional withdrawal is interpreted as noncompliance. Each write-up pushes inmates further into the system's punitive machinery. Classification scores rise. Security levels increase. Opportunities decrease. The path toward rehabilitation narrows until it disappears altogether. Solitary confinement plays a central role in this process. In Texas prisons, segregation is often used to manage behavior caused by overcrowding and stress. Inmates are removed from chaotic environments and placed into isolation under the assumption that separation restores order. What it actually does is compound psychological damage. Isolation intensifies anxiety, depression, and paranoia. It disrupts sleep. It distorts perception. It erodes emotional stability. Inmates return to general population more fragile than before, less able to cope with stress. This creates a feedback loop. Overcrowding causes stress. Stress leads to behavior. Behavior leads to punishment. Punishment causes mental decline. Mental decline leads to more behavior. The system responds to every stage with more control. Over time, punishment becomes normalized. Inmates expect it. Guards rely on it. Rehabilitation becomes secondary, then symbolic. Programs shrink as disciplinary needs expand. Educational and vocational opportunities suffer under overcrowded conditions. Space is limited. Staff is diverted to security. Schedules are disrupted by lockdowns. Inmates lose access to classes due to transfers or infractions. Even those motivated to change struggle to find consistency. This inconsistency sends a clear message. Effort does not guarantee opportunity. As motivation declines, participation drops. Inmates disengage. Time becomes something to endure rather than invest. Rehabilitation turns into a theoretical concept rather than a lived experience. Overcrowding also affects staff behavior. Correctional officers work in high-stress environments with constant pressure. Burnout increases. Patience wears thin. Interactions become transactional and authoritative. Empathy fades. Orders replace dialogue. This dynamic deepens the divide between inmates and staff. Trust erodes on both sides. Guards see compliance as the only path to safety. Inmates see authority as something to avoid. Communication breaks down. Misunderstandings escalate into incidents. Punishment becomes the default language. The human cost of this system is visible but rarely acknowledged. Mental health crises increase. Self-harm incidents rise. Violence becomes more frequent. Yet these outcomes are treated as individual failures rather than predictable consequences of overcrowded confinement. Texas prisons continue to rely on punishment because it is immediate and measurable. Write-ups can be counted. Segregation can be enforced. Order can be restored temporarily. Rehabilitation, by contrast, requires time, stability, and investment. In a system overwhelmed by numbers, those elements are always the first to disappear. By the time inmates approach release, many have spent years navigating pressure rather than progress. They have learned how to endure chaos, not how to build structure. They have learned how to respond to authority, not how to regulate themselves. The system then measures success by compliance, not readiness. In the next chapter, we will examine how this punishment-first approach affects mental health long-term and why Texas prisons continue to struggle with rehabilitation despite decades of reform efforts. Because as long as overcrowding defines daily life, punishment will always outweigh progress. Mental health as a liability, not a priority. In Texas prisons, mental health is acknowledged, but rarely understood. It exists in policy language, intake assessments, and diagnostic codes. In daily practice, it is treated as a problem to manage, not a condition to heal. Texas incarcerates tens of thousands of people with diagnosed mental illnesses. Anxiety disorders, depression, post-traumatic stress, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and substance-related conditions are widespread inside the system. Many inmates enter prison already struggling. Many more develop symptoms after prolonged exposure to confinement, overcrowding, and punishment-focused control. Yet mental health care remains one of the most under-resourced areas of the Texas prison system. Treatment is largely reactive. Intervention often occurs only after a crisis, an emotional breakdown, self-harm incident, or violent outburst. Preventative care is rare. Long-term therapy is limited. Counseling sessions, when they happen, are brief, infrequent, and focused on stabilization rather than recovery. Medication becomes the primary response. For many inmates, mental health care consists of pills distributed through a slot in the door. Antidepressants, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, prescribed quickly, adjusted slowly, and monitored inconsistently. Therapy that could help inmates understand trauma, regulate emotions, or change behavior is often unavailable. This approach treats symptoms, not causes. Worse, the prison environment actively undermines mental stability. Constant surveillance, lack of privacy, unpredictable routines, and the ever-present threat of punishment keep the nervous system in a state of chronic stress. Healing cannot occur in an environment designed for control. In Texas prisons, emotional distress is frequently misinterpreted as defiance. An inmate experiencing anxiety may refuse orders out of fear. An inmate with depression may withdraw and stop participating. An inmate with trauma may react aggressively to perceived threats. Instead of receiving care, these inmates are written up. Disciplinary reports replace clinical assessments. Infractions accumulate. Privileges are revoked. Segregation becomes the solution. Mental health struggles are folded into the punishment system, where they are exacerbated rather than addressed. This dynamic creates a devastating cycle. Mental illness leads to behavior. Behavior leads to punishment. Punishment worsens mental illness. The system responds not by breaking the cycle, but by tightening control. Solitary confinement plays a central role in this failure. Inmates with mental health issues are disproportionately placed in segregation, often under the justification of safety or discipline. Isolation is used to manage behavior that the system lacks the tools or willingness to treat. The psychological consequences are severe. Isolation intensifies hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. For inmates already struggling, segregation accelerates decline. Yet Texas prisons continue to rely on isolation as a management tool, even as evidence mounts that it causes long-term harm. Mental health units exist, but access is limited and conditions vary widely. Specialized housing often operates under the same restrictive rules as general population, with added surveillance and fewer privileges. Therapy may occur through cell doors. Trust between inmates and clinicians is fragile, undermined by the lack of confidentiality and the punitive environment. Many inmates stop seeking help altogether. Admitting mental distress can mark someone as unstable. Labels follow inmates through classification systems. Requests for care can lead to closer monitoring, restrictions, or segregation. In a culture where vulnerability is dangerous, silence becomes a survival strategy. As a result, suffering becomes invisible until it explodes. Texas prisons are particularly ill-equipped to address trauma. Many inmates have histories of violence, abuse, neglect, and addiction. These experiences shape behavior long before incarceration. Prison adds another layer of trauma: loss of control, constant threat, and emotional deprivation. Without trauma-informed care, rehabilitation is impossible. Programs aimed at behavior change often ignore psychological foundations. Anger management classes teach restraint, not understanding. Substance abuse programs emphasize abstinence, not coping. Inmates are expected to change behavior without tools to process the pain driving it. The system demands accountability without providing capacity. This failure follows inmates to release. When prisoners with untreated mental illness re-enter society, they face overwhelming challenges: housing instability, employment barriers, stigma, limited access to healthcare, medication interruptions, stress triggers everywhere. Without continuity of care, relapse is common. Emotional breakdowns occur. Minor violations lead to rearrest. The system labels this recidivism as proof of personal failure rather than institutional neglect. Texas prisons rarely track mental health outcomes post-release. Success is measured by rule compliance, not psychological recovery. This narrow definition ignores the reality that untreated mental illness undermines every aspect of reintegration. The burden then shifts to communities. Families absorb emotional volatility. Emergency services respond to crises. Jails refill with individuals whose conditions worsen behind bars. The cycle repeats, costly and destructive. Despite this, meaningful reform remains limited. Mental health care is expensive. It requires trained professionals, time, and stability. Punishment is cheaper. Isolation is faster. Discipline is easier to measure. These incentives shape policy decisions more than outcomes. As a result, Texas prisons continue to operate under a model that treats mental health as a liability to control rather than a priority to address. This choice has consequences. Violence increases. Self-harm rises. Staff burnout grows. Rehabilitation efforts fail. The system becomes harder to manage, not safer. The tragedy is not that inmates struggle. The tragedy is that the system is structured to expect struggle and respond with punishment instead of care. In the final chapter, we will confront the core question at the heart of Texas incarceration: whether a prison system built around punishment can ever truly rehabilitate, and what must change if rehabilitation is ever to become more than a slogan. Because as long as mental health remains secondary to control, Texas prisons will continue producing damaged minds instead of changed lives. Why rehabilitation fails in Texas prisons. By the time an inmate reaches the end of a sentence in Texas, the system assumes its job is done. Time has been served. Punishment has been delivered. Rehabilitation, if it occurred at all, is treated as a secondary outcome, optional rather than essential. But the evidence is clear. Texas prisons struggle not because inmates refuse to change, but because the system itself is not designed to support transformation. Rehabilitation fails in Texas prisons for one fundamental reason: punishment is the priority. Every aspect of the system reinforces this reality. From intake to release, control governs decisions. Discipline shapes daily life. Compliance is rewarded, not growth. In such an environment, rehabilitation becomes an afterthought rather than a guiding principle. Programs intended to reduce reoffending exist, but they operate within severe constraints. Educational courses, vocational training, substance abuse counseling, and behavioral programs are limited in number and inconsistent in delivery. Demand far exceeds availability. Waiting lists stretch indefinitely. Transfers, lockdowns, and disciplinary actions interrupt participation. For many inmates, opportunity arrives too late, or not at all. Even when programs are completed, they rarely address the deeper causes of criminal behavior. Trauma, mental illness, addiction, poverty, and social instability are treated superficially or ignored entirely. Inmates are taught rules, not resilience. Compliance, not coping. This creates a dangerous illusion of rehabilitation. Certificates are earned. Boxes are checked. Records reflect participation. But the underlying psychological and emotional drivers remain untouched. Behavior may change temporarily under supervision, but it collapses once control disappears. Texas prisons are efficient at enforcing rules. They are not built to foster internal change. The structure itself undermines rehabilitation. Overcrowding limits consistency. Lockdowns disrupt schedules. Staff shortages reduce program quality. Security concerns override therapeutic goals. When tension rises, programs are the first to be suspended. Punishment is stable. Rehabilitation is fragile. The culture inside Texas prisons further discourages growth. Vulnerability is unsafe. Admitting weakness can attract exploitation. Seeking help can mark an inmate as unstable. As a result, many avoid programs that require emotional openness, even when those programs could help. Change becomes risky. Inmates learn quickly that survival depends on silence, emotional restraint, and vigilance. These traits conflict directly with rehabilitation, which requires honesty, reflection, and trust. The system asks inmates to change while punishing the very behaviors change requires. This contradiction is never resolved. Release planning exposes the final failure. As inmates approach release, preparation is minimal. Job training is limited. Counseling is scarce. Mental health continuity is weak. Many leave prison without identification, stable housing, or employment prospects. The transition from rigid control to total responsibility is abrupt and unforgiving. Freedom arrives without tools. Former inmates are expected to navigate a complex society while carrying psychological damage, stigma, and instability. Stress triggers are everywhere. Authority figures provoke anxiety. Financial pressure mounts immediately. Support systems are fragile or non-existent. Relapse, whether into substance use, criminal behavior, or emotional breakdown, is common. The system interprets this as proof that rehabilitation doesn't work. But rehabilitation was never truly attempted. Texas prisons measure success narrowly. Rule compliance inside prison is valued more than long-term outcomes outside. An inmate who avoids infractions is considered manageable, even if mentally unprepared for release. A quiet prisoner is preferred over a healthy one. This metric hides failure behind order. Recidivism statistics tell the real story. Many released inmates return within years, sometimes months. Each return is framed as personal choice, not systemic design. The cycle continues, reinforcing the belief that punishment is necessary and rehabilitation is unrealistic. The cost of this failure extends far beyond prison walls. Families absorb the impact. Children grow up with instability. Communities face repeated disruption. Resources are drained by reincarceration. Trauma spreads outward, affecting people who were never involved in the original crime. Texas prisons are not isolated institutions. They shape society. The question is not whether rehabilitation is possible. It is whether it is prioritized. Evidence from other systems shows that rehabilitation works when it is central rather than optional. Stable programming, consistent mental health care, trauma-informed approaches, education linked to real opportunities, support during reentry. These elements reduce reoffending. They improve public safety. They save money long-term. Texas prisons choose a different path. Punishment is immediate. Control is visible. Rehabilitation is slow and uncertain. In a political climate that values toughness over outcomes, punishment is easier to defend. Rehabilitation requires patience and investment. It requires acknowledging that harm is often rooted in systemic failure, not just individual choice. That acknowledgement remains rare. As long as Texas prisons remain structured around control, rehabilitation will continue to fail, not because inmates cannot change, but because the system does not support change. This failure is not accidental. It is predictable. A system built to punish will always punish well. A system that treats rehabilitation as optional will always produce the same result. More damage, more returns, more broken lives. In the final outro, we will confront the broader implication of this reality, what it means for justice, public safety, and the future of incarceration in Texas. Because until punishment stops being the goal, rehabilitation will remain a promise never kept. The price of punishment. Texas prisons were built to control, not to heal. To punish, not to prepare. Behind concrete walls and razor wire, A system operates exactly as it was designed. Order is enforced. Compliance is demanded. Discipline is delivered. But rehabilitation remains secondary, optional, and often unreachable. This documentary was not about excusing crime. It was about exposing consequence. Because when punishment becomes the priority, damage becomes inevitable. Minds are shaped by fear instead of guidance. Behavior is controlled instead of understood. People leave prison having learned how to survive authority, not how to live in society. Texas prisons do not fail by accident. They fail by design. Overcrowding, isolation, limited mental health care, and a discipline-first culture combine to produce outcomes that repeat year after year. Inmates return not because change is impossible, but because the system never supported it. The cost of this approach does not end at the prison gate. Families absorb the fallout. Communities inherit instability. Public safety suffers. The cycle continues, reinforced by the belief that punishment alone is justice. But justice without rehabilitation is incomplete. If the goal of prison is to protect the future, then the system must confront what it is creating in the present. Because a prison built only to punish will always produce people unprepared for life beyond its walls. Until rehabilitation becomes more than a slogan, Texas prisons will continue doing exactly what they were designed to do. Punish. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.